The school hallways were always busy in the mornings, students rushing to their classes, teachers preparing their lessons, and chatter echoing through the walls. In the middle of this daily noise walked a woman most people barely noticed. She wore a simple uniform, pushed a cleaning cart, and moved from classroom to classroom with quiet dedication. She was the custodian, the one who made sure the rooms stayed clean, the floors polished, and the trash bins emptied too. To most, she was just the cleaning lady. Students passed her without a word, some even brushing by as if she weren't there. Teachers nodded politely but rarely stopped to talk. They saw her as part of the background, someone who kept things tidy while they focused on important work. But none of them knew the truth about her. None of them knew the world of knowledge hidden inside her mind. Her name was Clara. She had worked at the school for years, quietly doing her job, never drawing attention to herself. She was humble, gentle, and carried a smile even when people overlooked her. But Clara had a story no one at the school would have guessed. Long before she wore a uniform and carried a mop, she had been a student herself, an excellent one in her younger years. Clara had a gift. Numbers fascinated her. While other children struggled with basic equations, she found joy in solving complex problems. Mathematics wasn't just a subject to her. It was a language, a way of seeing patterns and order in the world. She would spend hours with her notebooks, filling pages with calculations, proofs, and the joy of discovery. Her teachers once called her a prodigy. Some even believed she might become a professor, a scientist, maybe even a groundbreaking mathematician one day. But life is not always fair. Clara's family struggled with poverty. Her parents worked long hours to make ends meet, and though they believed in her talent, they couldn't always afford the opportunities she deserved. Just when she was preparing to enter university, her father fell seriously ill. Clara was faced with a choice: continue her studies or step up to support her family. With a heavy heart, she chose family. She took small jobs, gave up her scholarship, and put aside her dreams of higher education. Years turned into decades, and Clara's life followed a different path. She worked wherever she was needed: cafes, stores, cleaning jobs, so she found a steady position as a custodian at the school. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work, and it allowed her to help her family survive. She carried herself with dignity, never complaining, never letting bitterness take away her kindness. Yet, late at night, when the world was quiet, she would sometimes sit with an old notebook and solve math problems just for herself. Like old friends, she had never truly left behind. At the school, no one knew this side of her. To them, she was simply Clara, the custodian. She swept floors, emptied bins, and polished windows. What they didn't see was that, as she wiped down chalkboards, her eyes often lingered on the equations left behind. When teachers scribbled calculus or algebra during their lessons, Clara noticed. She understood the symbols, the logic, the beauty of the numbers. Sometimes, when no one was watching, she'd solve the problems in her mind, smiling softly at the thrill of getting them right. The students saw her every day, but never really saw her. Some even joked among themselves, thinking she was just another worker who probably didn't finish school. Clara never corrected them. She had grown used to being underestimated. But deep inside, she carried her knowledge like a hidden treasure, a part of herself that no uniform could erase. Her coworkers admired her work ethic, but didn't know much about her personal life. Clara didn't boast. She didn't tell anyone about her love for math or how she had once dreamed of becoming a professor. She believed those days were behind her, locked away in memory. No, she had accepted her role quietly. But destiny has a way of revealing truth when you least expect it. And Clara's truth of brilliance of her mind was about to come to light in the most unexpected of ways. For now, though she remained unnoticed, pushing her cart through the halls, wiping down desks with patience and greeting students with small smiles. Nobody suspected that the custodian who walked past them daily carried the mind of a math genius. Nobody imagined that one ordinary day, a careless joke from a teacher would change everything and expose the brilliance that had been hidden in plain sight all along. It was an ordinary afternoon in the math classroom. Students were restless, scribbling notes half-heartedly while waiting for the bell to ring. The teacher, Mr. Harris, stood at the front of the room, chalk in hand, writing a long calculus equation on the board. To the students, it looked impossible: symbols, integrals, and numbers stretched across the surface like a foreign language. A few groaned under their breath, already defeated by the sight of it. Mr. Harris turned, smirking at the class. "This," he said, tapping the chalk against the problem, "is the kind of equation that separates the good students from the great ones." His voice carried a tone of superiority, one he often used to remind everyone who was in control. At that moment, the door creaked open. Clara, the custodian, stepped inside quietly with her cart. It was her usual routine: empty the trash, wipe the desks, make sure the classroom was tidy for the next lesson. She moved with her usual gentle pace, not wanting to disturb the lesson. Most of the students barely noticed her, but Mr. Harris did. Perhaps it was boredom, perhaps arrogance, or perhaps he wanted to get a laugh from his students. Whatever the reason, he looked at Clara with a glint of mischief in his eyes. He leaned against the desk, folded his arms, and spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "Hey, Clara," he said casually, "why don't you come up here and solve this equation?" For us, the class erupted in laughter. Students slapped their desks, exchanged amused glances, and whispered jokes. They thought it was ridiculous asking the custodian, the woman who cleaned their classrooms, to tackle a calculus problem that even they struggled to understand. Clara froze for a moment, her hand still holding the trash bag she had been about to tie. Her eyes flickered to the board. The numbers and symbols, so familiar to her, seemed to call out. But she also felt the sting of the teacher's tone. He wasn't asking out of respect, he was mocking her. To him, this was entertainment. To him, she was a punchline. The students laughed louder when she didn't answer immediately. One boy muttered, "She probably doesn't even know what calculus is." Another girl whispered, "This is gonna be funny." Mr. Harris smirked, encouraged by their reaction. "Come on, Clara," he said, pretending to sound encouraging but dripping with sarcasm. "Show us what you've got. Don't be shy. It's just a little calculus." The words echoed painfully. She had heard similar tones before in her life: people dismissing her, underestimating her, assuming she was less because of her job, her background, or simply because they thought they knew who she was. For a moment, she considered ignoring him, continuing with her work, letting the joke pass. But something inside her stirred. She remembered the notebooks she used to fill with equations late at night, the joy she once felt when solving problems. The pride she once carried before life forced her to set those dreams aside. Her heart beat faster. Should she stay quiet? Should she prove him wrong? She looked at the board again. The problem was difficult, yes, but not impossible. She recognized the steps instantly. To her, it wasn't a wall. It was a puzzle waiting to be solved slowly. Clara placed the trash bag back into her cart. The laughter died down a little as the students realized she was moving toward the front of the room. Mr. Harris raised his eyebrows, surprised but still smirking. He thought this was about to be even funnier. The classroom grew quieter as Clara walked toward the chalkboard. The students leaned forward, curious now. No one had expected her to take up the challenge. They thought she would refuse, embarrassed. Instead, she picked up the chalk with steady fingers, her eyes fixed on the problem. For a few seconds, there was silence. She stood there, staring at the equation, her mind already working through the steps. The teacher folded his arms smugly, waiting for her to stumble. waiting for the laughter to return. But Clara's face changed. The hesitation faded. Her eyes sharpened, focused, confident. She began to write. The chalk moved quickly, fluidly, as if her hand had been waiting for this moment all her life. She explained nothing, said nothing, just worked with precision, each step clear, logical, and correct. The sound of the chalk scratching against the board filled the room, echoing in the silence. The students stopped laughing. Their whispers died. Their eyes widened as line after line appeared on the board, neat and exact. Clara wasn't hesitating. She wasn't guessing. She was solving. Mr. Harris's smirk faltered. His arms slowly unfolded as he leaned forward, his eyes narrowing in disbelief. He recognized the steps she was taking. She wasn't just writing random numbers. She was solving the problem exactly as it should be solved. Clara reached the final line, wrote the answer, and set the chalk down gently. She turned, her expression calm, almost serene, as though she had simply done something ordinary. But the silence in the room told a different story. The students stared, mouths open, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. The teacher stood frozen, his face pale, his arrogance replaced by shock. The joke was over. But it wasn't Clara who looked foolish, it was him. For a long moment, the classroom was so quiet that you could almost hear the hum of the fluorescent lights above. The chalk dust still floated in the air where Clara had written. The neat solution glowing on the board like a spotlight shining. On the truth, the students who had been laughing only minutes earlier sat frozen in disbelief. Some leaned forward in their chairs, their mouths slightly open. Others exchanged quick glances, as if asking silently, "Did that really just happen?" The boy who had whispered she didn't know what calculus was now stared at the board, his face red with embarrassment. The girl who thought it would be funny to watch Clara fail now gripped her notebook tightly, her eyes wide in shock. For Clara, the silence felt heavier than the laughter had. She placed the chalk gently back on the tray, her movements calm and steady. She didn't boast. She didn't gloat. She simply turned back toward her cart, as if ready to continue her work. As though solving a calculus problem in front of a room full of doubters was nothing unusual. But the room wasn't ready to let her go. A student in the back finally whispered, "She got it. She actually solved it." Another student, braver, said louder, That's the right answer, isn't it?" His voice carried both awe and confusion. All eyes turned to Mr. Harris, the teacher. His face, once smug and amused, was now pale and tense. He adjusted his glasses nervously, his jaw tightening. He wanted to dismiss it, to laugh it off somehow. But he couldn't. He knew Matthew had written the equation himself. And every step Clara had written was flawless. "Yes," he admitted reluctantly, his voice lower than before. "It's correct." The class erupted not in laughter this time, but in gasps and murmurs of astonishment. Some students clapped instinctively. Others leaned closer to get a better look at the board. A wave of respect, mixed with guilt, for having underestimated her, filled the room. Clara said nothing. She didn't need to. Her solution on the board spoke louder than any words could. One girl near the front raised her hand shyly, her voice trembling as she asked, "Miss Clara, how did you do that so fast?" Clara paused, looking at the board again. Memories rushed. Back to her late nights with her notebook, solving problem after problem. Her teachers praising her when she was young, the dreams she had once carried. She gave a small smile. "I used to study mathematics," she said softly, her voice steady, but humble. "A long time ago." The room fell silent again, but this time it was a silence filled with respect, not mockery. The students looked at her differently now, not as the woman who cleaned their floors, a tit, but as someone extraordinary, someone who had just done what Many of them couldn't Mr. Harris shifted uncomfortably at the front of the room. His plan had backfired completely. What was meant to humiliate Clara had turned into his own humiliation. His students, who had always laughed at his sarcastic remarks, were now staring at him with questioning eyes. They could see the arrogance in what he had done. They could see how wrong he had been. Clara, however, did not gloat. She didn't shame him, didn't point out his mistake. She simply returned to her cart, picked up the trash bag she had been working with before, and tied it neatly, as if nothing had happened. That humility, that quiet strength, made the moment even more powerful. The students whispered among themselves, their voices filled with excitement. "She's a genius. She's smarter than all of us. I never knew she could do that." Respect had replaced laughter. Awe had replaced mockery. Even those who had laughed the loudest now sat uncomfortably, ashamed of how quickly they had judged her. They realized that their own arrogance mirrored the teacher's. They had seen her only as a custodian, someone unimportant, when in reality she carried knowledge far beyond their imagination. Clara pushed her cart toward the door, her expression calm, her posture dignified. But before she left, she turned back to the class, her eyes warm but firm. "Never underestimate someone because of what they do," she said softly. "Genius has no uniform." The words struck deep. The students sat in silence, letting them sink in. It wasn't just a math lesson they had received. It was a life lesson. When the door closed behind her, the classroom erupted again, but this time in loud conversations of wonder. Some students argued excitedly about how quickly she had solved the problem. Others shook their heads, still stunned. And a few simply stared at the board. Inspired by the brilliance they had just witnessed, at the front of the room, Mr. Harris remained silent, his pride wounded. He erased the board slowly, but each swipe of the eraser felt heavier than chalk dust. He had thought he was clever, making a joke at her expense. Instead, he had become the joke, and she had become the example of true brilliance. For Clara, it was just another day. She had not set out to prove anything. She had only wanted to do her job quietly. But fate had placed her in that classroom, in that moment. And her hidden genius had spoken louder than any insult could silence. And for the students, it was a moment they would never forget, lesson far more valuable than calculus itself. Clara had stood at the front of the classroom with the chalk in her hand. But before she wrote a single line, her heart had been heavy with hesitation. For her, it wasn't the problem on the board that frightened her. Mathematics had always been a place where her mind felt at home. No, what unsettled her was the weight of the eyes watching her. The laughter still echoing faintly, the expectation that she would fail. She could feel it pressing against her chest. The students were waiting for her to stumble, to look foolish. The teacher, arms crossed smugly, was certain she would embarrass herself. It wasn't the problem that was difficult. It was the moment her hand trembled slightly as she held the chalk. For a brief second, she thought of putting it down, of shaking her head politely and saying, "No, thank you." She could have walked away, continued with her work, let the moment pass. After all, she wasn't there to prove anything. She was the custodian. That was her job. But another voice rose inside her, a quieter, older voice. The voice of her younger self, sitting at her childhood desk with notebooks spread wide, scribbling equations late into the night because she loved the challenge. That girl had never been afraid of numbers. That girl had felt joy in solving what others thought impossible. And deeper still was another memory, her mother's voice. Never let anyone tell you that you are less. You carry more inside you than they will ever see. The hesitation clung to her like heavy chains. She remembered the countless times people had looked at her uniform and assumed they knew her story. She remembered being overlooked, underestimated, laughed at quietly. In hallways, she had learned to stay silent, to keep her brilliance tucked away, because what good was it if no one cared? But standing there, with the board in front of her and the room waiting, she realized something important. This moment wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had ever been judged by appearance. Everyone who had been underestimated because of a job title, a uniform, or the color of their skin. If she walked away now, the laughter would continue. And the teacher's arrogance would grow stronger. Her hesitation began to crack. She looked at the equation again. It wasn't a monster. It was familiar, like an old friend she hadn't spoken to in years, but still remembered deeply. She traced the steps in her mind, integrals, substitutions, simplifications. It flowed so naturally that she almost smiled. This was her world, her language. Her hand stopped trembling. She tightened her grip on the chalk. Slowly, she drew the first line, careful and deliberate. The numbers appeared on the board, and with them, her hesitation melted. Each step she wrote made her stronger, each symbol steadying her heartbeat. The classroom, which had been buzzing with laughter moments ago, grew quiet. She could feel the students' eyes shifting, their amusement fading into curiosity. The silence gave her strength, but inside, she still wrestled with doubt. What if they don't believe me? What if they mock me anyway? What if showing my gift only brings more pain? These questions tried to creep back into her mind. Then she reminded herself, this is not for them. This is for me. She breathed deeply, her body steadying as her mind took over. She let the years of hidden practice, the late-night problems, the passion she had buried, rise to the surface. Line after line filled the board, and her courage grew with every stroke of chalk. By the time she reached the final step, her hesitation was gone. She wrote the solution clearly, placed the chalk down, and turned to face the room. Her eyes were calm, her posture strong, her presence commanding. The class was silent, not with judgment now, but with awe. The teacher's smirk had vanished. Clara had walked into the room as a custodian carrying a trash bag. She had been mocked as a joke. She had hesitated, weighed down by years of being underestimated. But in those few minutes, she had remembered who she truly was, a woman with a brilliant mind. A math genius who refused to be defined by a uniform. Her hesitation had been real, but so was her courage. And in choosing courage, she had changed everything. The chalk felt warm in Clara's hand, though she knew it was only her pulse racing through her fingertips. She stood in front of the board, every eye fixed on her, waiting, doubting, expecting her to stumble. But inside her heart, something steady began to rise. It was not pride, not defiance, it was courage. For so long, Clara had kept this part of herself hidden. Years of working quietly in the background had made her believe there was no room for her brilliance anymore. But now, as she faced the wall of silence and expectation, she realized she could no longer shrink into the shadows. This was the moment. Her gift demanded to be seen. She lifted her chin slightly and turned her gaze back to the problem. The symbols no longer felt like a trap set to humiliate her. They felt like old friends calling her home. With a deep breath, she placed the chalk on the board and began. Her movements were smooth, precise. Each line she wrote carried with it a memory of the girl she once was, the young Clara who had raced through textbooks, who had stayed awake under the dim light of a lamp, solving problem after problem because it thrilled her soul. Every number, every symbol was a reminder that this was her language. One she had never forgotten. The students leaned forward, their laughter long gone, replaced by curiosity. The scratch of chalk against the board filled the room, steady and rhythmic, like music only Clara could compose. She paused only to glance at the steps, her mind already 2 moves ahead, anticipating where the problem would lead as the solution began to take shape. Clara felt the fear that had gripped her chest fall away. In its place bloomed a confidence she hadn't felt in years. Her back straightened, her hand no longer trembled. Her strokes grew faster, bolder. She wasn't proving anything to anyone anymore, she was simply being herself. The classroom was silent, but it was not the silence of mockery. It was the silence of awe. Students exchanged wide-eyed glances, whispering softly but quickly shushing themselves. Afraid to miss a step of her brilliance, Mr. Harris, the teacher, had moved from his casual, arrogant stance to a stiff, uneasy posture. His arms were no longer folded. His face, which had worn a smirk only minutes before, now looked pale and tense. He knew the steps Clara was taking. He could see her precision, and he could see, to his horror, that she was right. Clara continued, writing line after line, her explanation flowing naturally in her mind, even if she spoke none of it aloud. She didn't need to narrate, her clarity showed in every stroke. It was not rushed, not hesitant. It was confident, deliberate, alive. And then, with one final stroke of chalk, she wrote the solution. The answer glowed against the blackboard, clean and perfect. She set the chalk down gently, as though the act itself was sacred, and stepped back. For a moment, she said nothing. She didn't need to. The board was her voice. The numbers were her proof. Her courage had carried her through, and now the room was hers. The students sat in stunned silence, their expressions a mixture of shock and admiration. One boy whispered, "She did it." Another added, "That's incredible." A girl near the front began to clap softly. And soon the sound spread until the room was filled with applause, not mocking, not forced, but genuine respect. Clara didn't smile widely, didn't bow, didn't gloat. She simply gave a small, humble smile, her eyes calm, her presence unshakable. It wasn't about showing off. It wasn't about revenge. It was about courage, the courage to rise when others tried to push her down. The courage to reveal the truth about herself when the world expected her to fail. Mr. Harris cleared his throat, but his voice cracked slightly as he admitted, "Yes, she's correct." The words tasted bitter to him, but he had no choice. The evidence was on the board for all to see. His joke had turned into a lesson, and he was the one being taught. Clara turned back toward her cart, her work unfinished, her duties waiting. She picked up the trash bag she had set aside earlier, tied it neatly, and placed it back in the cart. Her movements were calm, ordinary, almost as though nothing extraordinary had just happened. But everyone in the room knew better. For Clara, this was not just solving a calculus problem. This was reclaiming the part of herself she had buried for years. This was the moment she chose courage over silence. This was the moment her hidden brilliance broke free for the world to see as she walked toward the door. She paused and glanced back at the students. Her voice was soft but carried through the room with weight and clarity. "Don't ever underestimate someone," she said. "Respect isn't about what people wear or what job they do. True respect is for the person and the potential you cannot see." With that, she left the room, pushing her cart gently, her head held high. The applause still echoed behind her, mingled with whispers of awed. The courage she had shown in that single moment would not only change how the students saw her, it would change how they saw themselves and how they judged others for the rest of their lives. The chalk squeaked faintly against the board as Clara's hand moved gracefully, line after line forming under her steady strokes. At first, her movements were careful, almost quiet, like a whisper. But as she grew more comfortable, the pace of her writing quickened, and the rhythm of her chalk sounded almost like a song only she knew how to play. The problem was not a simple one. It was the kind of calculus equation that made even bright students groan. The long integrals and substitutions were enough to intimidate anyone. But to Clara, it was like opening a locked box with a key she had carried all her life. Every step led smoothly to the next, every number falling perfectly into place. She began with the first step, rewriting the equation in its simplest form. Her handwriting was neat, her logic clear. She did not rush. She allowed each line to stand proudly before moving to the next. The students leaned forward, their notebooks forgotten. Even those who usually struggled with math could sense the precision in what she was doing. She wasn't guessing. She was building something, piece by piece, like an artist shaping a masterpiece. Mr. Harris stood stiffly at the side of the room. His arms no longer crossed. His smirk had vanished completely. Instead, his eyes followed each line Clara wrote, his face pale with realization. He had given her a problem meant to humiliate her. Instead, he was witnessing a solution that could rival his own. Clara paused briefly, tilting her head as she checked her work. Then, with calm confidence, she moved to the next step. "You see," she murmured, softly, not loud enough to boast, but just enough for the nearest students to hear. "It becomes simpler if you recognize the pattern here." Her voice carried warmth, like a teacher guiding a child through a puzzle. The students gasped quietly. She wasn't just solving, she was teaching. Her explanation wasn't complicated, filled with jargon, like the teacher often made it. It was clear, almost beautiful in its simplicity. She continued, factoring where others would have stumbled, simplifying expressions that often confuse students. Each move was deliberate, precise. Her body no longer looked like that of a custodian at work, but of a scholar in her natural space. Commanding the language of numbers, the whispers in the room shifted. No one was laughing anymore. Now they spoke with awe. "She's so fast. She actually knows what she's doing. That's brilliant." Clara pressed forward, her chalk dancing across the board. She reached the tricky part of the problem, the step most students dreaded. The room held its breath. Would she stumble here? Would she pause, confused? But Clara smiled faintly, as though she had anticipated this all along. Her hand moved confidently, applying a substitution that simplified the entire expression. The students gasped again, realizing that what had looked impossible only moments ago was now dissolving into something solvable. Even Mr. Harris couldn't hide his shock. His eyebrows furrowed as he leaned forward, muttering under his breath, "That's exactly right." Finally, Clara reached the last step. She wrote the solution cleanly, underlining it for emphasis. The chalk clicked softly as she set it back on the tray. She turned, calm and steady, her expression serene. To her, it had been nothing more than a challenge answered. A truth spoken in the only language she truly loved. The class, however, erupted. Students clapped loudly, some even standing in disbelief. Their faces lit up with admiration, their earlier laughter replaced by wide-eyed respect. A few shouted, "No way." Others whispered, "She's a genius." The energy in the room was electric, charged by the shock of what they had just witnessed. One student raised his hand, though he didn't wait to be called on. "Miss Clara, can you explain that substitution part again?" "I never understood it when he taught us," he said, pointing timidly at Mr. Harris. The class laughed nervously, not at Clara this time, but at the irony. Clara smiled softly. "It's not as difficult as it seems," she said kindly. She walked back to the board and explained the steps slowly, her words gentle, her tone patient. And for the first time, the students actually understood. Heads nodded as realization dawned. "Oh," they whispered, as if a heavy curtain had been lifted. Mr. Harris's face burned. For years, he had lectured these students. But here was Clara mocked moments ago, teaching them in a way that finally made sense. He shifted uncomfortably, tugging at his collar, but he could not interrupt. When Clara finished, she stepped back again, her humility shining brighter than her brilliance. She didn't wait for praise, didn't boast about what she had done. She simply picked up her cart handle, ready to continue her day's work as if nothing remarkable had just happened. But to the students, it had been more than remarkable. It had been life-changing. They had witnessed genius hidden in plain sight, revealed by courage and humility. And in that moment, they saw Clara not as a custodian, but as something far greater, a teacher, a mathematician, a role model. Her courage had solved more than just an equation. It had solved the ignorance of everyone who thought they knew her worth. As Clara reached the door, the applause followed her, echoing through the room like a standing ovation. She didn't turn back, but a small smile played on her lips. For the first time in years, she hadn't hidden her gift, she had let it shine. And though she walked out quietly, the lesson she left behind was louder than any words.